Ready? All right. So my name is AJ Seeley. I'm the Emergency Management Director. I'm going to walk around and move back and forth because I don't like to sit very long, and that was too long. So I took a little bit different approach here. So I'm going to do just kind of a basic outline of what we do at Emergency Management, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions. So I'll kind of skip through a lot of the text on here. There's a lot of broken PowerPoint rules, so don't judge me for that, but we'll get started. So overall, emergency management is kind of two things. Number one is we support all the jurisdictions in Dallas County. So we're the only emergency management agency in the county. In other states, they have like a city emergency management usually, but we're the only ones here in Dallas County. So we serve all of the jurisdictions. That includes the metro. It includes cities like West Des Moines, 70,000 population, down to Linden that's got 200 people, and the even smaller jurisdictions. So primarily where we like to be is helping out other jurisdictions. So we do as much as we can on the front side, help support the jurisdiction and their planning initiatives. And then we also have a responsibility to develop our own at the Emergency Management Agency. And so to some degree, it doesn't make sense for the city of Linden, for example, or another smaller jurisdiction to plan to X degree. At some point, it's just not realistic for their resources. And that's a moving target based on which jurisdiction you're in. So we kind of step in at that spot that it becomes unrealistic for them to plan and have a capability to do that across the county. So a lot of people don't know, so the Emergency Management Commission is actually not a county entity. So we're in the same building. Some of you probably know that, but we don't report directly to the Dallas County Board of Supervisors. So we have, by law, what's called an Emergency Management Commission. That commission is a board here of 20 members. It's the mayor from each of the jurisdictions, the sheriff, and one member from the supervisors. So they all get an equal vote. It's fun for me to navigate 20 different bosses, but collectively they make up the commission that guides the agency and gives direction on what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing in the emergency management space. There's kind of four main themes that we work in emergency management. There's preparedness and kind of planning. We do that on the front side. Mitigation, which is the act of basically removing the risk or lessening the risk. There's response, which is fairly straightforward. When something bad happens, we have capabilities to respond to that. And then there's the recovery piece, which is usually the much longer term, months to years process that we help to coordinate with our partners to get back to a state of normal. We do this through a methodology called the comprehensive plan. So a lot of people think that we have a specific plan for tornadoes. We do not. We have a methodology that we can apply our planning structure to any type of event. So you could argue that we have a plan for zombies if you want. We just take individual plan elements. So you'll see up here on the screen, there's 15 different plan elements that pretty much encompass all of the government resources, all of the things that are needed in an emergency. And then we pick from this menu kind of when we need to use certain elements. So let's say that we have an apartment fire that displaces 30 people. We're gonna pick from our mass care, which is ESF 6, kind of over there on the side, bring in some partners from the Red Cross and some other sheltering resources. We might pair that with some folks from transportation to move people back and forth. There may be a public health component to it and bringing in medications and that sort of thing to support whatever incident. There's obviously a fire component, so a whole bunch of different things. We develop kind of that overarching strategy and then lean on our partners to help bring in those plan elements. The other portion of our comprehensive plan is our recovery framework, and this is somewhat of a new thing for us. We kind of unveiled it, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, and it's the same sort of general concept, but there's a lot less partner groups. So these are a little bit more high level, but things like economic recovery, cultural recovery, you can kind of see the rest on the screen there. All things that we've had to deal with in the past several years. If you think about derecho, there's displaced residents that we needed to help define kind of a more longer term strategy for what that looks like. And a lot of the communication that we're doing is through jurisdictions to help maybe discuss what can be considered or what can be done in each of those jurisdictions to help mitigate that long-term housing problem. We also, with the shooting in Perry earlier this year, we stood up the recovery support functions, and we've been engaging on a regular basis, as often as like once every other day, pretty much right after it started. And then in the more long term, we've stretched it out on a longer term basis, but we're trying to address any of the specific needs that pop up as a result of the incident.
And what are you seeing? Now, like ongoing, like now currently in the period?
So right now, the primary goal of this resource group that we have is to identify some of the gaps, which is oftentimes hard for government to do, especially in somewhat isolated areas because of lack of trust of government and that sort of thing. But so feeding problems to us, initially it was things like we can't get food in this specific area because there's transportation type issues. And so we're then connecting with some of our partners to say, okay, can you help facilitate a process that's already in place to help make sure we're fixing and filling all these gaps so that there's not more long-term issues. We, thankfully, I'll say, have stayed out of the financial components of the Perry incident. That, unfortunately, is kind of a mess. But we did try to help provide some guidance early on to help kind of say, like, make sure that you have published what you're doing with these funds, and because there is always concern about everybody's got their own perspectives, and making sure that they're all being met or they're at least being established early on is helpful. As of right now, I work, one of my team members is kind of taking the lead, so I think I've missed the last 2 or 3 meetings, so have you been on? Feel free. Sorry.
I feel like a lot of it right now is getting like school teacher retention and keeping them in the schools, making sure people want to come back in the fall. The state had some cool programs that they were able to help like bring teachers in to support, so they could, the current teachers could go to therapy or go take a break when they needed it. We worked a lot with the mental health groups to get anybody who wanted counseling. All the first responders got debriefing, which you guys helped facilitate.
Yep. Yeah, the whole goal of the committee is basically just be a group that can take any problem and try to find a resolution. And early on, there was, I'm not gonna be able to think of all of them, but there was like 2 or 3 problems every meeting, and it was just every other day. And like a lot of these cases, it was really nice to be able to, like Abigail and her team were able to say, oh, we've got a partner connection to here that emergency management might not necessarily be aware of. And they were able to make that connection in 2-3 hours and had the problem fixed by the next day that it was happening. So it's really great to be able to do that in a timely manner, and especially when we're talking about feeding kids and that sort of thing, when there was that void. One of the other big things that we do, so we have a team of 3, and I kind of skipped over mentioning, I'll go back down here. The podium's probably in the way, isn't it? So Alicia is on the left side. She is our response planner primarily. Lynn is in the middle there. She does a lot in the planning role. And then myself as the director kind of fill in where needed and develop maybe a more overarching strategy. But so we have a team of 3, and to do all the things that we do during disasters is pretty much impossible with just a team of 3. So I can't reiterate enough, we lean heavily on our partners. And so public health and schools and government and you name it, we just are basically the connector to those agencies. So I kind of like to use the analogy of like an orchestra. We're kind of the conductors and saying what's going on, and then everybody's playing their own instruments. We're just helping to keep them all on the same sheet of music. We do that in an emergency operations center. So the room that's on the other side of this building that we're not using currently, this top left, is our emergency operations center. Looks like laser pointer's not working very well. But that's really the collaboration point that we do all of our communication in when it comes to a disaster. In the last 3-4 years, we've developed a more hybrid model where we might not all be in the room anymore, but we're still doing a lot of this via Teams or Zoom or some other virtual environment. Any questions? The same exists, I'll say, for like Polk County and our neighbors. Adair and Guthrie County, they have their EOC stood up right now for the Greenfield incident. And then above us at the state level, the state also exists to serve us. So. This kind of just shows the difference in coordination levels. So in emergency management, we typically sit at the more strategic level. So fire departments going and putting out the fire are going to be at the tactical level. They know exactly what they're doing and maybe into the operations level. But we really sit in this strategic level where we're talking with policymakers, mayors, elected officials, and saying, how do you want this to look like strategy-wise? And then we turn that strategy into a more operationally and tactical plan. As we kind of close out here, so this is our last year's involvement in incidents. This notifications on the left side, so we had 136 last year. Those are incidents that we were notified about that could rise to a level that we're needed on. So things like a lot of it's hazmat, fires, vehicle accidents, usually with some additional complexity component, utility related or other category. And then on the right-hand side there, we had 35 incidents that we were actually involved in and provided like EOC activation or maybe some field support or something along those lines. You can kind of see the breakdown by category there. Here's just kind of some pictures of some stuff that we do. So on the top left there, that's an incident a couple months ago in Boone that we helped to kind of coordinate some incident management type activities. Top right is a training that we facilitated for I think 60 or 70 folks. Bottom left, we get to have some fun sometimes and we do exercises. So this is one that first time it was done in Iowa, and we used the National Guard to put out fire with a helicopter, which was pretty cool, and hopefully we can do that in the future. And then on the right-hand side here, this is an actual incident that we had in Urbandale, I think, yeah, September-ish of 2023, where that major water outage occurred, and there was, I think, around 10,000 people without water. And what we ended up doing, there's not like a real great count of how to figure that when you have an outage. So we pulled in our partners from GIS and we said, okay, here's the area that's out. Use the parcel counter to figure out how many parcels are affected, and then we use some math and based on census averages to gauge what actual response would need to be like and how many people are actually affected. Initially, our estimate was a lot lower than what it was when we actually pulled the parcel data. So it's just one example of how we can use our different partners, GIS in this case, and then that figure was a driving factor for how we got water from Hy-Vee or volunteer organizations to help facilitate getting it to the community. That's all I have. Happy to answer questions. I don't have a fun dog or a jail, thankfully. So.
So will you go over and help Guthrie, like with the tornado in Greenfield?
Yeah, we did. So that was a really cool thing about emergency management, and really all of Iowa, just like our neighbors help each other, emergency management and public safety all do the same thing. So all of our staff went over on Tuesday, the day of the incident, and then throughout the next week, we spent variable amounts of time there. I demobilized on the following Monday, so I was there for 6 or 7 days. And then the other cool thing is, like, it wasn't just us, it was other emergency managers from across the region, across the state. And Abigail actually came over to help serve in the role of public information officer. So they're a lot differently resourced there, and so we were able to use what's called a Iowa Mutual Aid Agreement or IMAC agreement. And basically, when there's a declared event, you can reach out to emergency management, and we can essentially make a mutual aid agreement with any jurisdiction, any political subdivision in the state of Iowa to get resources. And those resources can be anything from computers to people to dump trucks. And so we leverage those types of things. And yeah, it's good. It's valuable experience for us too. I mean, we haven't had a tornado like that since I've been here. So it's good for us to learn. Yeah, I'd prefer to not. We have had 3 tornadoes this year, so that's enough for the year.
Yeah, we don't
So the question, because I don't think the mic will pick up, the question was, how can we best, when we want to volunteer or donate resources, how can we best do that without causing additional burden? That is a big issue in the post-disaster world when there's a lot of media attention, especially, is everybody wants to donate something. People think of it sometimes as like, oh, time to clean out the closet. Like, that's not always a great thing. We do want the resources, but there's additional factors that we have to consider when those things are happening. So I'll use Greenfield as an example. They had an immediate donation of anything you can think of. They probably had 10 to 12 semis within the first 4 days, just full of various clothing, diapers, cleaning supplies, and pretty much anything you can think of. They had a church there that took over that role and essentially was serving as a kind of like a grocery store. People could just come in and take what they needed. The challenge is, at some point you have to say, we have enough stuff and we can't take anymore. And they ended up having to do that, I think, by day 5 or 6. And so if there is a desire to do some donations type stuff, it's important that those are coordinated with whatever the organizational structure is. So like for us, if we have something like that, we'll have our emergency operations center stood up. That's a good way to just say, hey, we want to do something, how can we help? And before you go and organize something that might not be needed, make that connection. A lot of people don't necessarily like donating money, but money is kind of one of the better things to donate because it's very portable. And when we identify a need, we can then go get whatever we need by the need versus us asking for a specific, we need box shovels or something like that, because those are a little bit harder to get from the public on donations. They're not wanting to donate specific items.
So when you want to do a donation, a dollar donation, where do you do it? How does the public know about that?
So when a disaster happens, the question, again, for the mic, was how do you make a donation? What's the appropriate source? So when a disaster happens, then there's usually some sort of communication between the Emergency Operations Center, Incident Command, and whoever has the incident or whoever is wanting something out of the incident. So in the Greenfield case, they identified pretty early that the Adair County Community Foundation was the host source for that. And so they had that relationship kind of pre-set up and said, yeah, just advertise our information and we'll use that route. For us, it's pretty variable based on what happens. Like in Perry, we saw some GoFundMe set up. There's the school funds. There's kind of a whole bunch of different ones. We try to get ahead of that as much as possible so that whatever is being set up is in a kind of more controlled environment. But sometimes that's just not the reality with the resources that we have, unfortunately.
Can you talk a little bit about why it's important for folks not just to show up and why for tracking and for
Yeah, so the question was, can you talk about why it's important for folks not to show up? For the microphone. So post-event, especially one that has a federal declaration tied to it, well, number one, from a safety aspect, we don't want people to just show up and start helping because we don't know that the environment's always safe. And if people are helping, despite their good intentions sometimes, it can actually cause negative downstream effects, maybe negative interactions with public safety into the future. Things like that maybe we don't necessarily think about. That's not I'm not totally discouraging neighbors helping neighbors, but it is important to work within the structure once that structure is established. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
like how you track.
Oh, yeah. So on a federally declared incident, we track volunteers, and the reason we do that is because as a local government, we're responsible for 15% of the cost associated with the disaster. FEMA actually recognizes what's called in-kind donations, and they will allow you to use volunteer hours that you had people contribute as a portion of that in-kind. So if you, let's say that we called in 100 volunteers, and they contributed at a rate of $15 an hour, which is not the current rate, it's higher, but just for simplicity's sake. And then the value of, let's say they work 10 hours, there's $15,000 of match built in right there, if my math is right. So, which might be 1 0 off. We've got a finance division for that. So, nonetheless, it's important for us to track those hours and the volunteers because it ultimately means that there's going to be less taxpayer impact on paying that match, which means a better recovery in the long run.
Do you ever do any kind of presentations like at the high school level, the junior high level, or elementary? I mean, just what you do seems so neat, and I think that, you know, I don't know, I just think it's just kind of cool for the kids to, yeah.
Yeah. So the question was, do we ever do any sort of school presentations? We have done some when it's been requested, but generally we don't have like an annual like visit to the schools like a lot of fire departments do. I don't know that we would have a total capacity for that right now, but yeah, emergency management is kind of a niche profession when it comes to like, when you think of public safety, you think of like EMS, fire, and law enforcement. And we kind of sit in like a different administrative but sort of response entity where we develop strategy that all of those agencies kind of use. So it is very, it's very different, but yeah.
Thank you for all you do, you and my team of 3.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks.